Little things add up to big things, okay? So here's your pep talk today. Little things add up to big things. I had someone on the stream last night as I was playing some Final Fantasy ask, how do you stay motivated? And really, if you have your process really set up correctly, then motivation starts to become a lower and lower issue because the process has its own momentum. It's part of habits. It's just part of something you do. You feel compelled to do it because it's just part of your day, like getting up and eating in the morning if you eat breakfast. So that's one of my biggest pieces of advice, is that motivation will not be as much of an issue if you habituate what you're doing, if you habituate your process to a greater degree. But the big one here is that little things add up to big things, which is to say, if you're doing something on a daily basis, if you're doing something very frequently, if it's part of your routine, part of your process, your daily process of living, then that can yield actually really big results over the long run. So even if you're trying to write a book and you're only getting through a couple hundred words a day, a couple hundred words a day can add up real fast. So there's people who have only written one book in their life, and that's a big accomplishment. But you can actually, even just writing 500 words a day, finish a book in like half a year or a little bit more, So 1,000 words a day will yield you a pretty lengthy novel, 100,000 word novel, which is longer than most of the books you had to read in school, at least, in 100 days. You'll be done with the drafting process at least in 100 days. So even if you're at half that, 200 days, you're still at a little bit over half a year and you've written a book. And then at the end of that, you'll go, I wrote a book. Very few people are able to write books because they're not able to habituate that process. They're not able to just sit down and make attempts to write every day for a long enough time until something emerges and something good enough emerges. And through that repetition of process, even a small amount of work will start to improve what you're doing, improve your skill set in sometimes really, really massive ways that you don't really expect. Now, I first learned this really as a music student, because as a music student, it's all about practice. This is what they tell you all the time. You got to practice, practice, practice. And there's more to it than just practicing, because how you practice matters quite a bit. And that's something that I was trying very hard to get my students to understand, is that the ways in which you practice also matter, not just the fact that you're getting your instrument out every day. But even if you're getting your instrument out every day for 15, 20 minutes at a time, and that's pretty much all you're doing with it, at the end of maybe 6 weeks, you'll notice, whoa, all of a sudden I can play music. And then at the end of a year, your improvement is going to be just massive. It's going to be much more than you thought was possible. So I first learned that as a music student. And once I really got my practice down and got my practice routine kind of entered into my life as part of my habits, and I'm not really good at forming habits. This is something that I've had to learn along the way. I'm not a good positive habit forming person. I'm not a person that can decide I'm going to practice every day and then do it. I tend to fall into other habits. So reprogramming my habits has always been something that's tough. I just had to learn how to do it. So once I got my practice routine down and I was doing it every day, all of a sudden I went from being like really bad at the guitar, honestly, to being pretty much the best player I knew. Within, a year or 2 years, I went from being terrible to being really, really good. Good enough that like neutral people would say that I was a better player than any other person I knew, including like one of my teachers. Like, oh, he's your teacher? Well, like, you're better than him. It's like, oh, thank you. I appreciate that compliment. But it really, all of that growth just happened because of the consistency of practice. And you don't really see a lot of the improvement while you're in it. So it's also important for motivation to take stock of where you're at every once in a while. Take a look at what you've done and compare to where you've been. So take a snapshot of what you've done and look back. Sometimes when you get kind of rolling in the process, you don't really think about how far you've come and what you've actually accomplished. And I have this with me too, is that I often, the last couple of weeks, I felt like, man, I just don't have any time to work, don't have any time to write. I felt this for a while, and it's, it kind of can take a little bit of toll on you. You stop and you look and you're like, well, I'm going to finish this book up that I'm writing probably this week. I'll probably be able to finish it, looking realistically at what I've done every day. And I'm not even working that hard, which means I'll ship it in October. And that'll be the third book I printed this year, third book I published. And I have like 2 more pretty much ready to go after that. So it's like, I've done a ton of work. I actually have come a long way, and I'm more productive than most people. Even though when I'm in the middle of it, I'm like, my process is not as good as I want it to be right now, because I'm very stacked with time. I'm very distracted by other things in my life. There's other things that concern you and take mental energy away from what you're doing. Take stock of what you're doing, and you realize you've come a long way. It's the same thing with, say, diet and exercise. If you can habituate your exercise routine, then you're gonna feel like you didn't do something right if you skip. If you skip your exercise, or if you eat wrong, you'll notice it right away. So making that part of your habitual process will yield big results. I'll give you an example. Years ago, I was hanging out. I think this was might have been at my bachelor party with an old friend of mine from high school who was he my best man at my wedding? Or was he just in it? No, I think I only had one person in my wedding. It was my brother-in-law. It was my best man. But anyway, he's like, how'd you lose all this weight? Because I'd lost like 100 pounds. And I'm like, it's just a bunch of little things. It's just a bunch of little things that add up to a crap ton of weight loss, And I gave him an example. It was like, he's always drinking orange juice. He had these orange juices with him, and he would drink one every day. I'm like, so, let's look at that orange juice, for example. Like, how often do you drink orange juice? He's like, well, I drink one of these a day because it's good for you. I'm like, well, it's 200 calories. And it was like a little bottle. Orange juice is really calorie dense. It's more calorie dense than, this is a diet soda, but, regular soda is actually less calorie dense than orange juice, than a lot of these juices. So juices to me are treats. There are sometimes, I would drink juice as often as I would drink, say, regular soda or beer, which is not very often for me right now, really in general. So I just said, hey, if you stopped drinking that orange juice, how much weight would you lose? I don't know. Well, it's 200 calories a day. That's actually could be pretty significant. And so to lose about a pound of fat, you got to burn off about 3,300 calories. So if you cut your calories by 200 a day and you add all that up, figure it out, like you'd be 20 pounds. There'd be a 20 pound of fat difference in 1 year if you just stopped drinking orange juice. And if you stop drinking orange juice and soda, you probably lose 30, 40 pounds in 1 year, just changing a couple things. Just saying, I'm going to drink Coke Zero instead of regular Coke. I'm going to skip the orange juice and I'm going to drink water in the morning. Or I'm going to skip the orange juice and I'm going to have a Splenda coffee or something, right? So just those little changes, all of a sudden it can push your weight, because if your weight's the same, that means, calories in, calories out. That's how thermodynamics works, right? So if your weight's stable, that means you're eating the amount of food that you're burning every day. So save 200 calories, all of a sudden it adds up to 20 pounds. And you just do a couple things like that. I stopped drinking the orange juice, so stop drinking the soda. Instead of eating a hamburger, or like a full hamburger with everything on it, I don't have the cheese. And you add up the cheese. Oh, you'd lose 10 extra pounds just cutting the cheese off your cheeseburgers. You'd lose this much. If instead of eating French fries, you ate baked potatoes. If instead of eating the potato chips, you ate popcorn, right? You add up all these little substitutions that don't seem like a big deal. It's like, oh, instead of snacking on the potato chips, I eat the popcorn, and the popcorn's 50 calories and the potato chips 300 calories. You're saving, all of a sudden you've lost 50 pounds in a year, maybe more. Just changing little things without having to really think about, oh, how many calories am I eating and that kind of stuff. Just changing a little thing. So it can have a big impact. And a lot of people have drastically altered their physical appearance just by making little changes like that, or giving up beer. So just as an example, I've known people that would drink 4 or 5 beers a day and not really think about it, or at least a couple of beers a day, 2 or 3, and they don't really think about it. But they're overweight, man, I got to get in shape. How do I get in shape? It's if you just stopped drinking the beer, you'd be really lean. You'd lose a lot of weight if you just stopped drinking the beer. The beer, it adds up. It really adds up. So it can add up in the opposite direction too. Things can drag you down. Lots of little things that have a negative impact on you can end up having a bigger negative impact. Oh, I'm gonna have potato chips. I'm hungry. I'm gonna eat a cookie. I get home. I'm a little bit stressed. I'm gonna have 2 or 3 beers, and before you know it, you're 50 pounds overweight. And indeed, I had lost weight and then I gained some weight back, and I gained back like almost 40 pounds, really about 40 pounds. But it took 8 years. So 5 pounds a year, right? 5 pounds a year is not that much. So the first year, you don't really notice it. And you don't really notice it each year until you're like, man, I'm not as good looking as I used to be. And then, well, you got to turn that around. You know, you got to make a bunch of cut out those other little changes. Oh, I've eaten, eat donuts every so often. Eat this and it adds up to, it's not a big thing, but it adds up to 5 pounds a year. And over time, that adds up to 40, 50 pounds of weight gain. Right, so that's another example. So it's the same thing with writing, same thing with music. Make little positive movements, and you'll find yourself at your goal a lot sooner, and that's going to feel very satisfying. And you're also, if you take those snapshots, you'll feel yourself moving closer to the goal, and you'll have a better idea of what is in there. Now, a lot of this stuff is in my book. Where did I put it? Keys to Prolific Creativity. I'm so creative that I forgot where I put all my books. I got like stacks of books to sell here. So here you go. Keys to Prolific Creativity. You can actually listen to the entire audiobook here on YouTube if you want to. It's got all this stuff in addition to, basically this content's in my videos as well. But if you want it all in a nice little organized book, I have that in there. It's the importance of creating good habits. A lot of this stuff has to do with how you manage your life and how you organize your time and where your priorities are rather than big things. So the last thing I guess I'll say is to contrast with that, you have like the boot camp. And I talk about like the boot camp mindset in here too, because you can use this. But people go to fitness boot camps and they'll have a personal trainer like yell at them for 6 weeks, and they'll exercise really hard, and they'll like they'll cut some fat off and maybe get stronger, and they'll feel really good about it. But then they don't transition away from that. When it's done, what happens? They just start doing what they did before, and then they gain the fat back. They don't go to the gym. They don't train with that intensity, and they just lose everything they had. So you can work with high intensity bursts, but to me, that's more stressful and not as effective as just having little things that add up over time. But for some people, it's just not real. Like let's say if you're a soldier on deployment, it's rather difficult to write a book when you're deployed. It's just, you could do it. Like you could bring a notebook and write lots of little things, but it's not going to be as effective as if you're actually sitting down at like your computer, at your word processor, typing out the words. So when you get back, then you have the writing sprint. I'm going to write 3,000 words a day for 6 weeks and just get a book done. So you can do that depending on how your life is arranged, because different people have different things. But, with these fitness boot camps, that's the main thing I see is people just kind of rebound and go back to where they were. And then they felt good about themselves for like 2 or 3 weeks, and then that's the end of it. And we used to see it, say, like with these, I grew up as a Mennonite Brethren, which is a Protestant evangelical sect. And you'd have these church camps, and people would get really excited about ministry. They'd get very excited about, their life as a believer. And then we'd have this phrase, coming down off the mountain, because you go to these like summer camps like up in the woods here in California. People would come down off the mountain literally and just kind of fall back to where they were. They'd stop feeling it, right? They'd stop feeling as good about what they were doing. They'd stop, they wouldn't keep up their study. They would go back and do their old habits that they felt ashamed of and things like that. And so people would just backslide into their normal bad behavior. And that's because those short intensity bursts don't create the long-lasting things. It'd be better if you really wanted to change your life just from a spiritual or sin perspective, is to change one little thing at a time until you're close to where you want to be. You just make a commitment. I'm going to go to mass every week and do that, or I'm going to do this every week, or I'm going to actively focus on just like maybe you have an unhealthy relationship with caffeine. I'm going to just tackle that one issue, this one vice that I have, which is that maybe I drink, and I'm kind of in it, and I'm okay with it right now because I'm just in a place where I am dieting, and the caffeine is part of that. But eventually I have to like dial it down and let me just focus on removing this vice from my life, and don't try to focus on being perfect at all moments. So you're just going to fail and feel bad about yourself because everybody fails. And if you fail at a day in your process, it's not a big deal because, I wrote 6 days this week instead of 7. It's not that big a deal. You'll get there eventually because those little things end up adding up. So anyway, that's my pep talk for today. Thanks so much, guys. And let's maybe check out some